Let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a journey from the lofty, kind of abstract theory of what a right actually is, straight down into the incredibly messy, complicated reality of global politics. It's a totally fascinating look at how our highest moral ideals inevitably clash with the way the world actually operates. To map all these concepts out, we've broken the explainer down into 5 parts. We'll hit the nature of rights, the source of human dignity, the unity of all rights, who bears the duty, and finally, the sovereignty clash.
Starting off with Chapter 1, the nature of rights, and the critical difference between righteousness and entitlement.
We often confuse two very fundamental concepts in everyday language. We'll say an outcome is right, meaning, it's fair or equitable. Like a lot of people think it's right to tax the wealthy at a higher rate. But being right is vastly different from actually having a right. Having a right means you are uniquely entitled to a specific thing. It creates this special relationship where your claim literally trumps other calculations of what might just be good or desirable for society. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that just because an outcome is right or desirable doesn't mean anyone actually has a formal entitlement or a right to it.
And honestly, that perfectly illustrates why human rights even exist in the first place. Think about it. You don't usually need to claim a human right if your national laws are working perfectly for you, right? If you can get justice down the street at your local court, you just use your standard civil rights. Human rights, on the other hand, are these paramount moral claims that are uniquely utilized when national laws completely fail an individual. Ultimately, it's the language of victims and the dispossessed.
Now here's a really fascinating paradox for you. The ultimate goal of asserting a human right is actually to put that right out of a job. It's what theorists call a self-liquidating claim. When activists assert a human right, they're aiming to alter the underlying political and legal structures so permanently that the right no longer needs to be claimed in that desperate way. A perfect historical example is the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. The goal wasn't just to continually shout into the void about human rights, it was to permanently change the South African legal system itself so that non-white citizens could simply rely on their own legislature and courts for equal protection. They wanted to fix the system so they'd never have to appeal to international human rights again.
Moving on to Chapter 2, the source of human dignity and how we move beyond basic survival.
So where do these rights actually come from? Well, if we just relied on pure biology, the list would be awfully short, wouldn't it? We're talking food, water, oxygen, just the absolute bare minimum for basic survival. But human rights go way beyond that. They derive from a moral vision of human possibility. They outline exactly what is required for a life of full dignity. It's a bold assertion of what human beings could become, not just what we physically need to stay alive as biological organisms.
That brings us to Chapter 3, the unity of all rights, where we need to break a massive false dichotomy.
You will hear this specific political argument all the time. The idea that civil and political rights, things like free speech or a fair trial, are cheap, negative freedoms because the state basically just has to back off and leave you alone. And conversely, the argument goes that economic and social rights like housing or healthcare, well, those are expensive, positive entitlements because the government actually has to step up and actively provide something. But as we're about to see, that is a completely false dichotomy. Just think about the supposedly cheap negative right to a fair trial, or the right to property. To actually guarantee those rights, the state has to build and operate an incredibly expensive, massive infrastructure. I mean, we're talking about funding genuine periodic elections, building totally independent court systems, training thousands upon thousands of police officers, and running complex property registries. State inaction does not protect your property. A shockingly expensive, hyperactive state system does.
Because of this massive functional overlap, the 1993 Vienna Declaration explicitly laid out that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. It's essentially a giant web that relies entirely on itself. You simply cannot live a life of full dignity if you are well fed and housed, but you can't freely vote or speak your mind. And conversely, the right to free speech means absolutely nothing if you are starving to death. The rights fundamentally rely on one another. You can't separate them. But philosophically speaking, we run into a pretty major roadblock here. Having a right is completely, utterly useless if no one is actually obligated to fulfill it. If a right exists out there in the ether, someone must have the actual duty to make sure you get it. Otherwise, it's really just empty words on a page.
Which naturally brings us right into Chapter 4, Who Bears the Duty, looking at everything from families up to the state. The philosopher Henry Shue broke this down beautifully into 4 actionable steps.
It starts with a basic respect, which just means not depriving someone of a right. Then it moves to actively protecting them from being deprived by others. Step 3 is to promote, meaning providing the effective enjoyment of that right. And finally, step 4 is to fulfill, which is actually aiding those who are actively deprived.
So who actually performs these steps? We almost instinctively assume it's just the government, right? But surprisingly, human rights are guaranteed by a highly complex, interconnected mix of public and private provisioning. While the state definitely holds the ultimate responsibility, just think about healthcare for a second. Children often get their care through their families via private markets, while the elderly might get direct provision through the state. So ensuring human rights on a practical level requires coordinated, active participation from markets, employers, families, and the state. It takes the whole shebang.
And now, for our final act, Chapter 5, The Sovereignty Clash. It's international standards versus state control.
To really understand this clash, we have to zoom way out. For roughly 300 years, starting way back with the Treaties of Westphalia in 1648, the global system ran purely on state sovereignty. The modern era of human rights, it's just a tiny blip in comparison. Even though the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted in 1948, the contemporary international human rights era truly only kicked off as a serious global political force in the 1970s.
The fundamental rule of this older, 300-year-old traditional system is that states have exclusive jurisdiction over their own territory. For centuries, the absolute golden rule of international relations was basically, mind your own business. States had a strict, agreed-upon obligation not to interfere with the internal actions of other sovereign states.
And this is exactly where we hit massive geopolitical friction, because these two concepts are on a direct collision course. State sovereignty demands exclusive internal control and total non-interference, but human rights? They demand universal moral standards and external scrutiny of a state's internal actions. Think about it. Enforcing human rights literally requires the international community to judge how a state treats its own citizens inside its own borders. That directly violates that centuries-old traditional norm of sovereign non-interference.
We can see this exact tension play out in modern history all the time. The source material for this explainer points to major events like the 1989 Tiananmen Square response in China, or the 2018 assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. In both of those cases, brutal actions were met with massive, almost universal international outrage based entirely on human rights standards. But in both cases, the traditional forces of sovereignty, long-term economic interests, and security alliances eventually collided with that outrage and ultimately overrode any serious, lasting global sanctions. The international community continually, painfully struggles to weigh human rights against state sovereignty.
We've seen today that human rights rely on this incredibly complex, interconnected web of duties to protect human dignity. Yet they have to operate in a world legally structured to actively prevent outside interference. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. As long as states remain fiercely sovereign, how do we ever effectively enforce the very universal rights we all fundamentally share? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.